Hey everybody, let's start this journey. It's our first week here. What I'm going to do in this series of lectures, there's 3 lectures, is just kind of provide a basic overview to risk, particularly supply chain risk, and then also talk about the supply chain process, and then talk about supply chain risk management. So those are really 3 very distinct topics, as I think you'll see. There's been a lot written about risk, risk management, resilience, all those kinds of topics. You can look them up and Google them and you'll see them. There's a lot of concern about that. And so the first thing we need to do is kind of understand how we're looking at risk. And that basically is here. And that is that risk is still looming. For most of us, manufacturers make sourcing decisions for lots of reasons. They may be domestic, they may be international, but all of them contain an element of risk. It doesn't matter. But the more globalized your operations are, particularly your sourcing operations, the more likelihood you are that you're going to experience some level of risk or disruption somewhere in the process. Now, that doesn't mean cargo theft. It doesn't mean terrorism. What it means is there's going to be some kind of a disruption that takes place that could jeopardize your demand plan. Which could ultimately jeopardize your financial results, and ultimately then result in a business continuity issue. So there's a lot of competition out there, as you know. Almost all the world is doing some amount of global sourcing. As well as global trade. And so what's happening in that environment is part of the risk that we're looking at. So we know there are political and currency risk. If you're not looking at things like currency exchange rates and things like that, you should probably just kind of familiar yourself with it. So when we talk about, when the administrations talk about currency manipulator, what that means in terms of competitiveness, either into the U.S. market or out of the U.S. market. Certainly the political landscape right now is unknown. There's a lot of talk, but there's 2 sides to every story, and we'll see how this all shakes out. But it does shake out in terms of uncertainty, and so this does cause some aspect of risk associated with what's going on. So there's a lot of investment being made by a lot of companies all over the world for lots of different reasons, including supporting domestic markets, even having plants in China to support the China middle class. So there's a lot of activity going on, and we could find ourselves in a big trade war or not. And so we'll have to see how this takes place, and the series of things that takes place that we see Congress do in the first weeks and months will be very telling. Certainly, this is one that's gotten an awful lot of attention, and justifiably so. So this we'll talk about under security. Terrorism we'll talk about under security. And then these things we call disaster preparedness, whether they're natural or man-made. We do know that they exist out there, and we know they can happen at any time. They can be unexpected, or we fail to plan for them. The things that are totally unexpected we call black swans. So you'll hear the term black swans as we go through this semester as well. And then recently we had an Internet of Things cyber attack. It came out of China, where the hackers attacked millions of Internet of IoT connected devices. And they did so because the passwords that were originally set on the devices were never changed. So right there you have a learning, particularly as we move into more interconnected devices. This is probably one of the bigger security risks from the IT security side that's out there right now, which is how do we protect ourselves against this. And if you paid attention recently, they found some Russian malware on a Vermont dam, a water dam. Not that Russia would have done something with that, but it could have shut down the dam. It could have opened the dam unexpectedly. So this is taking place, and my guess is it's probably two-sided. I don't know to what extent it's being done or perpetrated out of the United States by United States intelligence, but when you find these kinds of things, it is an absolute wake-up call. So risk is out there, and the more extended you are in the supply chain, as we see in the next section, you'll see the higher the risk. And this risk is a very big, broad area, and we're going to narrow it down. Actually, quite frankly, the biggest risk we have is people just not assuming that it applies, and I'm calling that apathy. It's basically saying we don't have a plan. We're not going to have a plan. We'll deal with the crisis when the crisis occurs. And people are not taking, or companies are not taking the risk management situation seriously. And that's part of the purpose of this class, is for you to come away with a sense that you do need to take it seriously, in that you do need to determine whether but through a risk assessment, whether or not uh, where those risk points are. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about doing that kind of a risk assessment, why you would want to do that kind of a risk assessment, and somewhat strategize what your plan is going to be, what your backup plan is going to be in the event that something happens. So the number one issue is not machines, it's not computers, it's human beings, not taking the situation seriously enough. And one of the goals of this class is to give you some things to take back um, to your employers, um, and not and perhaps float these ideas internally. So the University of Tennessee did a study not too long ago, and I'm going to share the results of it. And I mean not too long ago, I mean like in the last 12 months. They looked at 150 supply chain executives, and they interviewed about their risk management practices. And this is a very telling report. But they found that for these 150 companies, and they were all different sizes, by the way, so they're not just all the Fortune 500 or whatever. They found this, that of over half the spending for these companies was 45% non-U.S. Now, non-U.S. can be Canada and Mexico, and 55% within the U.S. So one of the questions you might want to undertake as a risk assessment is, what is our spend? How much of our spend is domestic? How much of our spend is international? This is very important. And I'm being assisted here by two dogs, Hattie and Charlotte, who are going to keep me straight and narrow. And then on the non-US, then you break this down into regions as well. And we're going to do a little bit of this through a program called CHIPS, which is a risk assessment program that is available. It's obviously available on a subscription program because it is a consulting service, but we'll get some high level stuff out of this. And of this 25%, they found that 20% was in Asia. And the issue with Asia is the volatility of what's happening. One, it's a longer supply chain, right? So anytime you have you have more handoffs in the process, you increase your risk. There's going to be some kind of an issue with it. You also have political and the currency instability, which we know is very true with the Chinese RMB, with the rupee, with the yuan. So there's a lot of currency instability because nothing's pegged anymore. So it's floating, and those instabilities and going up and down and staying within established ranges is something that makes companies more or less competitive, or countries even more or less competitive in the marketplace. The other thing is this thing here is that Asia is a very big hotbed for natural disasters, whether it's volcanoes, whether it's earthquakes, whether it's tsunamis, whatever it is. There's a lot of weather-related disruption that takes place out here, much more so than these other parts of the world. So that's something to keep in mind as you kind of go through this. Okay, so let's talk about enterprise versus supply chain. So enterprise, basically another part of this study that they did was they defined that as a result of what they looked at in describing or trying to come up with something, what the disaster plan is. It has to include suppliers, providers, brokers, agents, port officials, transportation teams. So all this stuff, all these all these connections, all these network connections, or nodes, if you will, are part of your risk assessment, and the partners you have in each of those nodes are part of the risk assessment. So a good example would be we know we have when the Port of LA and Port of Long Beach shut down a couple of years ago, it trapped freight all over the place for weeks. So that's a risk. The same thing with Hanjin, with the South Korean ocean liner going bankrupt over a weekend, and all of a sudden they couldn't pay their bills and nobody would unload their cargo. So those are just two examples. There's many types of cargo, of many types of things that could happen here. It can be customs, it can be governmental, it can be whatever it is. Um, so the most important thing to you from a supply chain perspective is that the customer doesn't care. That's not their problem. Their problem is that they're looking to do some aspect of business with you, either purchase goods or whatever. And if you don't have it, they'll go find somebody else. So this is part of the end game here and the justification for doing a risk assessment. So when UT looked into this more, they found that 7 out of 10 companies did have some kind of a documented response plan in place. And that included things like product substitution, proactive communications, or maintaining inventory buffers, which of course are expensive, in as part of the result. But interestingly enough, looking at all these companies, nobody used outside expertise in assessing the risk. It's basically everybody was doing it internally, which means you really have to understand what your supply chain looks like in order to really do that risk assessment. And it's highly unlikely that all the key points that go into a risk assessment are being covered by that. And of the 30% that don't have a plan, they don't consider it at all. So that's an issue because these things, as I said in the overall announcement, the syllabus, it's not if, it's when it happens, because it's very likely going to happen at some point. And the whole point of this, and one of the point of this part of the points of this class is for to be ready for it when it does happen. And so this is an ongoing, continuous process. But that will give you an advantage, competitive advantage in the market if your competitors is part of this 30%, which doesn't seem to have it. Another interesting thing is that the risk a lot of these companies do have risk managers, but they're not in operations. They're in legal or finance. So what we see is this. Let me move this out of the way here. So what we see is this. We talk about enterprise risk. We're talking about this: product liability and overall financial issues that affect shareholder value. That's enterprise risk. So something that would occur like the airbag exploding. That was enterprise risk. The Takata, I think is what it's called. You can see how GM had to respond to that. They responded to it from the product liability side. They responded to it from the financial side, but they didn't respond to it publicly from the supply chain side. So all of a sudden, any car with a Takata airbag, you had to question or not whether I was going to put that in. And if I did choose to install that Takata airbag, I was just simply continuing to add on to this. But what we want to talk about here is looking at supply chain risk as a separate part of the enterprise risk, because it's really, at the end of the day, if there's an issue with product liability, if there's an issue with purchasing or procurement or quality, it's going to come down and come back on supply chain. And if you don't believe that, it will. I can absolutely guarantee you it will. The supply chain is the first entity, whether you call it a supply chain organization or supply chain process, but they're going to look to the supply chain side, say, what are we going to do now? How are we going to get out of this? How are we going to get our inventory positioned? How are we going to move our manufacturing? And it's going to come right down to working together with your colleagues within the firm. So the issue is, again, I'll restate this many times, is the issue is not eliminating risk. it's not possible because of things like black swans. You cannot eliminate risk. What you have to do is mitigate risk, and that's what this is all about. So it's all about risk mitigation, and risk mitigation is having the ability to do these kinds of things. That is, be able to see what's taking place within the supply chain and who are the parties to those transactions, collaboration with your suppliers, which this all involves information sharing in both ways, two-way information sharing, which of course exposes data files to potential cyber attacks, if that's going to be the case. So you have to know who you're engaging with and who you're sharing information with, and making sure that you vetted them to a point where you're comfortable that no one can get behind your firewall. And that takes multiple functions and departments to make sure it happens, but it's going to be led by the supply chain team. So in control, you're going to want to narrow your supply base down generally, and then you have to be extremely flexible. You have to have a recovery plan that says if this happens, then this is what we're going to do. If a carrier goes out, then we're going to switch to this carrier right away. We're not going to lose any time to do it. So again, this is not about avoiding risk. You are eliminating risk. It's not possible. Don't even think you can do that. What you want to do is you want to mitigate the risk. And to mitigate the risk, you have to identify the risk. So that's the message that we're bringing into this class. And we're going to look at it from perspective of safety. We're going to look at it from a security perspective, from a disaster perspective, and then we're going to look at it from what I call the business continuity side, and cybersecurity and other kinds of risk management tactics, which we're going to discuss next. So the key here is just this. That is, so get your visibility, collaborate, improve your control, and improve your flexibility. So that's the message in this first mini lecture. So I'm going to stop now, and we'll come back and pick up with the supply chain side.